Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive. Newspapers.com makes it easy to find your family's story with more than 500 million digitized newspaper pages from the 1690s to today. Search for obituaries, marriage and birth announcements, photos, and more in papers from across the U.S., the UK, Canada, and beyond, stretching back 3 centuries. For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering 20% off a Publisher Extra subscription. Just use the code Genealogy Adventure at checkout. That code is Genealogy Adventure for 20% off Publisher Extra.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Donya Williams. How are you guys doing today? It's a hot but beautiful day outside.
Indeed, as always, thank you for spending the next hour with us today.
Yes. So I want to jump right into it because y'all know I like it when we come across the fierce women. And we have definitely come across a very fierce woman. Her name is Deborah Sampson, and we're going to be talking to her with our friend and my co-worker, Forrest Crosley. Now, Forrest Crosley was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, and as a child, he developed a fascination with history and archaeology. He received a BA in anthropology with hopes of one day doing field archaeology, and for 16 years worked first for the National Park Service and later archaeological contracting agencies. He was actively involved in archaeological fieldwork as well as a lab technician, where he assisted in the analysis of artifacts uncovered during fieldwork. He participated in the excavation of prehistoric Native American and historic period archaeological sites in Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, D.C., and Pennsylvania. He also did this in Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Alaska. In July 1999, he began his current job at the Daughters of the American Revolution as a staff genealogist. In the past, he served in the capacity as Assistant Director of Applications and now serves as Assistant Director of Supplementals. Topics of special interest in genealogy include the use of deeds and land records in genealogical research, tax lists, and legal genealogy. Welcome, Forrest. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me this afternoon.
Yes,
we're excited.
Welcome to the show. And because we have a lot of, we kind of like to touch on jobs in the genealogical field. If you wouldn't just mind us spending a little bit of time just kind of talking about what your role is at the DAR.
Well, as assistant director of supplementals, it's kind of a multi-pronged role. I check the work to a great extent of other staff genealogists who have verified the DAR applications of members. And I also, to a great extent, I help out others when they have questions regarding particular genealogical records or if there are issues of lineage or Revolutionary War service. If we perhaps don't have Revolutionary War service for someone who's supposed to be a patriot, then I try to find Revolutionary War service for them. There are all sorts of different types of questions that emerge during the process of reviewing these DAR applications, and it's a fascinating job, in that I get to see all sorts of records over many different years and in many different states. So I get a real cross section of different types of records, different states, different time periods, and it gives it, I kind of wind up being a jack of all trades as opposed to a master of anything. Because on one paper I might be dealing with someone who perhaps has a Massachusetts ancestry, in which all the town records name all the children's births, and you have the whole family kind of laid out in the town records. And then the next paper I might be dealing with someone from Georgia, in which it's just the opposite, and everything in between. So it can be real challenging, but it's very interesting.
Oh, I am sure. And because we have a lot of we have a really good mix of, in terms of our audience, between hobbyists and professionals. And we do have hobbyists who are thinking about turning their kind of genealogical passion into a career. So thank you for that great summary. Because it gets people thinking about what kinds of jobs there are out there.
Right.
I've got a quick question from an audience member before we get right into
Sure.
Deborah. So the question is, as an African American woman, how can I join the DAR? If I can answer part of that question, if you can document your descent via a paper trail, you just go to the Daughters of American Revolution, you get the application, you fill it in. Am I right in correctly thinking that the DAR is now accepting Y DNA tests?
They do to some degree. I freely admit I'm not a DNA specialist. The one thing, if you were to try using a Y-DNA connection, is it can be a little bit challenging in that you then have to find, since there are these women, of course they'll have to find someone who is a male, a direct line male, and then they have to basically have yet another individual who can trace back to the patriot in question too, or back to the ancestor. I'm not going to say back to the patriot, but to the ancestor in question you're trying to make a common link to. And that can be difficult, and it can be challenging to find all the proper connections, and so it can be a lot of work, going from the DNA approach.
Yep, I can imagine, but I hope that answers her question. So, Deborah Sampson, how did you come across her, and then what was it about her story that you really just dug into?
Well, and Danya brought it to my attention and asked that I speak about Deborah Sampson, and I really admit I had never really looked into her story. Once I began to do so, it turns out to be a very interesting story, a very compelling story. She dressed up as a male to join the Continental Army, and that is why Deborah Sampson's story stands out from the rest. As I mentioned to you previously, when doing the research about Deborah Sampson and her life, and in many ways, her life seems to be somewhat ordinary by comparison to perhaps other women of the time period, but it was her extraordinary deed of dressing up as a male and joining the Continental Army and serving for a year and a half that set her apart, and it's a really neat story. As I had mentioned to it, it's become somewhat mythologized over the years, and so sometimes separating the mythology from the historical Deborah can be challenging.
And I'd like to start with that point because I've watched innumerable YouTube videos, and I have a feeling that what you were just talking about the mythology and the legend versus the facts has kind of gotten blurred. So some of the things that I've heard about her on these videos was, I think we can all agree that she came from what would be considered a working class family. I believe her father had died when she was quite young. It was her mother. Her mother had a lot of kids. So she went to work quite early. Now, I've heard two different words associated with her, that she was either an indentured servant or that she was apprenticed. Is that so? I guess just starting there, which
Sure.
one of those things is any of that correct?
Well, yes, it's going back to her childhood too. I know one of the ways that most people, I would say that probably the way in which most individuals are familiar with the story of Deborah Sampson is from the 1797 memoir of her life. It was published in the Female Review. It was called the Female Review, or the Memoirs of an American Young Lady, published by Herman Mann in 1797. And this is the way that her story became known to the American public. And there are factual things in there, but it's also a very embellished story. And so when I read through this, there were many pages, many passages. He goes on for long periods of time, and there's nothing said about Deborah in particular, but he goes on and on. You're right, she came from a working class family, and one of the things that it brings up in Herman Mann's memoirs is that her father died at sea. And this was one of the things that became very interesting, in that it turns out there was a particular book that I found very helpful by Alfred F. Young called Masquerade, The Life and Times of Deborah Sampson, Continental Soldier, in which he tried to address, he using the memoirs as his yardstick, he then began to kind of follow the historical Deborah. And it turns out that apparently his parents, or her parents, separated. The father moved up to Maine. At some point, the story was concocted that he died in a shipwreck. It appears that in reality he shacked up with a woman in Maine, had a second wife, common law wife, and basically kind of abandoned the family. You're right. She came from had a number of siblings, and so at an early age, her mother, Deborah Bradford Simpson, she kind of had to farm out the kids, and so even as a young girl, according to the book Masquerade, Deborah was probably, she was born in the year 1760 in Plimpton, Massachusetts, and at about the age of 5, she was farmed out, first to some relative of her mother's, and she stayed there 2 or 3 years. Then she was farmed out to someone else, and it was about 1770 when she was taken in by the Thomas family, the family of Jeremiah Thomas, and I believe his wife Susanna. And that is when they start talking about the quote unquote indentured servitude. In his book Masquerade, Alfred Young said he was in the process of looking for documentation for her, he was unable to find any actual indenture. So it looks like, if anything, she was just kind of taken into the family, and she seems to have served there for a number of years. The common practice in Massachusetts at the time was boys could be indentured or serve with another family if they were in similar circumstances, until they were 21 years of age and they were free to go. And they said girls often stayed with another family and lived with another family until about age 18, or until they got married. So it does appear that she was with the Thomas family from probably about 1770 to 1778, and they had a number of boys. So she was around a bunch of guys growing up when she was a teenager, and helped raise the family. she look in hindsight, she does kind of look back, and she thanks the Thomases. She gives them with respect and gratitude. They gave her a place to stay, and and apparently they kind of allowed her to kind of sell some chickens and so forth, as long as she spent the money appropriately. And then once she became of age, turned 18 or so, that's kind of when she branched out on her own. But she doesn't. She seems to have had a very sad life in many respects. You know, her parents seem to have quarreled a lot, even in her brother's pension statement. Her brother Ephraim died in 1810. But his widow received a pension long after Ephraim's death. And there are family notes that talk about Ephraim's family and Deborah's family. And one of the things they said was that their parents quarreled a great deal. And this probably led to the parents' separation. And as a result, her mother went on the basically the poor relief rolls for the town of Plimpton. She had a bunch of kids to take care of, and at one point, someone from the town of Plimpton went up to Maine to try to track down Deborah's father, Jonathan Sampson, and try to hold him accountable. And it turns out, according to the author of the Masquerade, turns out he and Deborah's father, Jonathan, and his second common law wife, they were on the poor rolls of the town in Maine. So she did not have an easy life, and by all accounts, she probably, her father never was in her life very much.
Okay.
Did her did her family serve also?
Her brother Ephraim did.
Okay.
He served in the and he died in 1810, before most of the pension acts, but his widow was later pensioned for his service. He also served for Massachusetts.
Okay, and I've got a quick question about the poor rolls. Where can researchers find those?
Those you would be looking at those in the town records, and there are, and I call them that, but they aren't actually referred to that as such. But you look in the town records where you'd have to comb through them, and combing through these town records can be laborious. It can be very time consuming. And in talking with a colleague of mine who has done a lot of New England research, I asked him, New England is wonderful in the you know, when you're doing genealogy, they record all the children's names and and the parents and so forth, unlike the southern states. And I asked him if anything of that had to do with because at times towns would take on the financial responsibility for trying to help people out. And he said, yes, it did. And so they wanted to keep record the people who were considered kind of the legal residents of that town. And in New England, you do find what they're called warnings out, where if someone and their family was becoming a legal liability, not a financial liability to the town, and they felt that you were actually a legal resident of a neighboring town, then they would, quote unquote, warn you out. You warn you and your family out to leave that town and go back to the hometown where you're a legal resident, to have them take care of you. And that's what you're kind of seeing with her mother, is that she's trying to get some legal assistance to help raise the kids.
Because I'm going to say this is really interesting, because we don't really talk about people who lived either at or even below the poverty line.
That's right.
in terms of trying to research them in the record. So this is kind of new territory for us. So I know in Virginia and North Carolina, and I think, and Dawn, you can correct me, South Carolina, there were people called the overseers of the poor. Is
Yes.
that roughly the same title for them in Massachusetts?
I don't know necessarily that. I've never seen that particular term used in in Massachusetts. But for instance, like the town selectmen would have had a hand or, in that type of thing. You would certainly would have had individuals who, if that was not their title, that was really what they did. Yes, the overseers of the poor, trying to help people out.
So
I
for
want
all
to
of us,
say, let me say this one thing, because we got a lot of people asking questions about how to join the DAR.
Oh, gotcha.
I want to just clarify some things. He may be able to answer some, but we are going to really focus on Deborah.
Sure.
Looks like we're going to have another show on joining the DAR. I don't
Oh,
know.
gotcha. Okay.
or we can
But,
throw a link up to the show where we actually talk about, because we have
and
talked about that more than once.
we have. So I just wanted to let everybody know, because I got like 3 questions that's popping up asking about how to join, and as an African American, and it is
Sure.
possible. And then the other thing is,
Yes.
there is a daughter in our virtual audience that can definitely help out. She's always willing. That's Shelly Murphy. She is a daughter, and she
Good.
knows how to go about doing that as well. So thank you, Shelly, for being on the show today.
Yes, thank you,
Inadvertently.
Shelley. So Deborah turns 18, I believe. Her indenture's done. She
Correct.
decided that she really wasn't up for getting married at that point in her life. I
Right.
really get the sense that she was quite the free spirit.
I agree. And yeah, that's definitely the type of person she comes across as.
So here's my next question, and I promise we will get into the military service. Again, there's contradictory information about what happened next. I heard that she was an itinerant weaver, going from town to town, weaving cloth. I heard she was a school teacher because she had self-educated herself to a degree that she could be. What did she do next?
Well, that's Brian. That's kind of what I've gathered from kind of here and there is that she kind of did a number of things, and yes, there does appear to be some truth to the whole teacher thing. There were somewhere along the way somebody was able many years later able to find people who had actually had her as a teacher, and she appears to have been a rather strict teacher. Didn't take a lot of guff from the kids. She kind of had a reputation in that respect. Even a grandson recalls her being rather strict individual. But yeah, she kind of did a number of things to make it along in life. And you're right. Whereas at a point in time when a number of girls might have started to come of age where they're looking about to get married, she doesn't come across that type. I mean, in the memoirs of Herman Mann, he goes on for a number of pages about a prospective love and so forth, and even in 1784 when they in the newspapers when they first are breaking the story of her having served, that one of the reasons that they offer that she went into the service was because there was someone was trying to get her married. Their parents wanted to get her married, and she developed the word antipathy. She developed an antipathy toward this individual. She had no affections for the guy, and she went out and joined the military. But yeah, those trying to find the actual documentation for is challenging.
Okay, so I'm going to hazard a guess that love of discipline is probably what helped her in her period of service. So she tried to enlist once failed and then enlisted again.
Correct.
Can you tell us about those two enlistment stories?
Sure. The name under which she is well known, when she's known to history, is Robert Shurtleff. She enlisted under the name of Robert Shurtleff in May of 1782. However, earlier in 1782, she did enlist under the name Timothy Thayer, and this when her enlistment under the name Timothy Thayer is more vague, because she never actually joined up with her unit. Someone recognized her at some point. The version that I get is that she was perhaps paid a bounty to join up, and then she wound up spending some of that money. One of the versions said that she paid back some of the money. Nothing ever happened to her though, but she was discovered, and so she never joined up with her unit. It was a few months later then that she then dressed up as a man a second time, and this time she went down the road a little ways, and she tried to enlist and succeeded in enlisting under the name of Robert Shurtleff.
And for the benefit of the audience, just so they can get the gravity of what she was facing, what she did was an arrestable offense.
Yes. And that's one of the interesting things too, because one thing I discovered just the other day is in one particular source, they had a particular copy of her September 3rd, 1782 excommunication from her church. She had belonged to a congregational church when she was in the town of Middleborough, which is where she served her indentured servitude. And while she was there, she joined up with a Baptist church in 1780. Well, in September 1782, they excommunicated her, and part of the reason they say she was dressing up in men's clothing, and she enlisted as a man in the army, and although she was never convicted, and this I think hints at the Timothy Thayer. They don't mention it by name, but they said although she was never convicted, yet she was strongly suspected of being guilty, and for sometimes behaving very loose and unchristian-like, and so she had just kind of disappeared from the church. Now this was in September 1782, and she enlisted in May of 1782. So she's already off in the military. But they don't call her by either name, Timothy Thayer or Robert Shurtleff, in the excommunication. But they were aware that yes, she did in fact dress up as a man and enlist.
So I'm getting the sense that a woman dressing as a man was a cause for palpitations.
Yes. That's right.
Didn't let it stop her though.
And that's an amazing, that's part of the extraordinary part of the story.
Indeed. So what was her actual first, well, I guess before we get into her first battle, so where did she train? I mean, I'm assuming there must have been a period where, all of the people who had enlisted had to go somewhere and then just learn the basics.
Correct. And she joined up. She in March of 1782, the state of Massachusetts enacted some legislation to raise 1,500 men to serve in the Continental line, the Continental Army. So for each town in Massachusetts, they had quotas. And for instance, the quota for the town of Middleborough, where she was living at the time, initially, their quota was 11 men. For the town of Uxbridge, there was a quota of 5 men. Well, it turns out when she went dressed as a male and went in search of to sign up, she found someone who was looking from the town of Uxbridge, and on May 20th she enlisted. To engage her services for the town of Uxbridge, and she was paid £60 enlistment bounty. 3 days later, she was mustered into the Army, into the 4th Massachusetts Continental Line Regiment, into Captain George Webb's company. At the time was commanded by a Colonel Shepard, and later by a Colonel Henry Jackson. The particulars of where she went, it's not real clear. She would have served almost certainly some time, perhaps in Worcester, where she first entered the service. From people who tried to then follow the unit at that particular point in time by looking at other individuals who served in the same unit who were perhaps pensioned, and see where did they say they served. It appears this particular unit at that particular point in time was sent to New York State. So she likely spent a fair amount of her time in New York State. And in one account, someone looked at, there's only one muster roll that shows the name Robert Shurtleff on it, and it's dated November 1782, and it's for Captain Webb's light infantry, and the individual who wrote the book Masquerade, Alfred Young, he followed a number of names on the muster roll with Robert Shurtleff, and then tried to see, are there other pensioners whose paths perhaps follow a rather similar path to Deborah's. There was one private that he discovered and that he thought perhaps gave us some insight, a man by the name of Roger Barrett. And he spent a lot of time in Westchester County, New York. Per both the memoirs, which are somewhat embellished, as well as her own later accounts, her pension record and petitions that she petitioned to the state of Massachusetts. She was wounded in battle at Tarrytown, New York. She may have been married. In fact, she may have been wounded twice. And at least in the story of the memoirs, there was one story where she digs a musket ball out of herself and sews herself up. She had a lot of gumption. One of the biggest points of contention over her purported military record, per the memoirs and per her pension record, and what the actual documentation says, is that the memoirs state that she joined up in 1781 and was with her unit at the siege of Yorktown in September and October of 1781. And it's a very thrilling story, because in the memoirs, Herman Mann says that she was personally involved in the storming of the British redoubts at Yorktown, and that was an attack that took place in the dark. The muskets were not loaded. It was fixed bayonets. This was very, very bloody business. This was hand-to-hand fighting. And he says, and she was there. And in fact, later when she, in her pension affidavit for the federal pension under the Act of 1818, she does make the statement that she was witness to the capture of Cornwallis at Yorktown. However, we actually have copies of her enlistment record. So we know that she actually enlisted on May 20th, 1782, which is about 6 months or so after Yorktown. So we know that she couldn't have been at Yorktown. More likely than not, though, I think probably she was serving with men who had been at Yorktown, because she was serving with the Continental Line unit. I did read some accounts that the regiment she was with, the 4th Massachusetts, was at Yorktown, and there were a number of New Englanders who did take place on the attack of the British redoubts. So no doubt she knew men who actually had stormed the redoubts, and so she could tell a very compelling story because she knew these men, and she was involved in skirmishes herself and was wounded, but she was not at Yorktown.
That's awesome.
The story that I heard about her being outed, as it were. So I'm thinking, between enlistment, training, the initial battles, no one suspects, or at least on record, no one suspects anything. They accept her as what she's presenting, that she's a man. But it's so my understanding, and by all means do correct, is that whatever battle she was in, and she got the musket ball in her leg, and she literally dug it out because she did not want to be found out. She didn't want to go to the hospital, but she got infected and ended up having to go to the hospital, and it was the doctor who discovered that she wasn't really Robert, that Robert was actually a woman. Is that correct?
And this, you're correct in that she was actually, my understanding from the story, from both the 1784 newspaper accounts, which are after the fact, after she's been honorably discharged, but before the memoirs. And they said that she was with troops in Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's what I read.
Something happened, and she came down sick when she was in Philadelphia, and a number of troops apparently came down sick, and it was there that her secret was out.
And Barnabas Binney was his name, Dr. Barnabas Binney.
Yeah. Correct. He according to the story that I've read, he kept her secret to himself, and he kind of took her in for a time. Eventually, according to both the memoirs as well as what I've been able to read about, perhaps more the fact-based kinds of things, she was basically at some point sent from Philadelphia back to New York State with a letter from Dr. Binney to General John Patterson. And she didn't realize what was in the letter at the time. She was just asked to take the letter to General Patterson. And she gave the letter to General Patterson, in which Dr. Binney then told her secret. Now, the only thing is what's kind of interesting is that in both the memoirs as well as the 1784 newspaper account, she served as a waiter for General Patterson from sometime around the spring of 1783, perhaps until around the summer of 83. So she in fact, this was in going back to General Patterson, she was going back to someone who was basically a friend. That was something that really helped her out in her particular case. So that when she is discovered, and General Patterson, brings this to her attention that we know the story now. She's among someone who still is going to stick up for her and who's going to fight for her. And in fact, many years later, in 1802 and 1803, she went on a lecture circuit in various towns in New England and New York State. And while she was in New York State, and she even kept a diary of her travels. And she says she visited her old Captain George Webb, in New York State, and she was invited to stay a month at the home of General Patterson, who she called an old friend. So she was when she went back to General Patterson, she was going back to somebody who knew, who she, I think she felt would be in her corner.
Oh, that is nice. And from what I understand, historically speaking, in terms of documentation, she's the first woman to actually be a circuit speaker.
Oh, really? That's it.
Yeah, that I was going to bring that up too, Brian, that they said that because she started to talk about her times in the war and what she went through. And, one of the things that I was looking for was how she got the cut over her forehead, like which battle was that? But I couldn't find it. And it's just amazing to me. Like she was in real live battles. Like
Oh, yeah.
she led one where it saved a lady. She led another where they captured 15 people. Like Jesus, she was not one to be played.
Not with the bayonet.
No.
That's right.
Or a gun for that matter.
Or a
She was
gun.
not the one.
Yeah, that's the thing, in the one of the I love the account from the newspapers of January 18, 1784, because it's right after the discovery. She was honorably discharged on October 23rd of 1785 at West Point. And then in January of 1784, the story kind of breaks the news, and it was first broken in New York City in January 10th. But they're telling the basics of her story and saying that she was a female soldier who served in the Massachusetts line, dressed as a man. They don't actually tell her name, but they said she served with credit as a waiter in a general officer's family. That she served gallantry with she had a spotless military record, and they said she passed by the name of Robert Shurtleff while in the Army and was born on the rolls of the regiment as such. So we know that this is the individual that they're talking. They're talking about Deborah in this respect. So she had, by all accounts, she served with honor, and she was honorably discharged. So she served just as any man would serve.
So I've got a quick comment, and I know Donnie has got questions about Deborah's husband. So my comment is, Deborah actually proved that women could do not just combat, hand-to-hand combat, but women couldn't legally serve in the U.S. military until centuries afterwards.
That's right. That's right.
1948, I think, was when women were, or 1958, something like that. I saw the date and I wrote it down, and I can't remember, but that's when women started to show up into the Army. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about her story too. The book of Masquerade talks about how in the 1970s and the 1980s, as the women's rights movement began to grow, people became much more interested in her tale, in her story, and particularly in the state of Massachusetts, which is certainly understandable. And she was eventually she was named as the Massachusetts state heroine. And in fact, it's interesting that we're giving this presentation today, May 22nd. Because on May 23rd, in the state of Massachusetts, it's Deborah Sampson Day.
Oh, wow.
because she was mustered into the military on May 23rd, 1782. So tomorrow will be the anniversary of the day in which she first mustered in with her unit.
Happy anniversary, Deborah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I want to go into who her husband was.
Sure.
Gannett, Mr. Gannett. I want to know more, I guess, about him and the children that they had, because the fact that this lady, went into boxing matches, you may as well say, came out, came out on top. She was knocking men out, and she was doing her thing, and then come home and do just what women can do, which is be a lady and have a child and all of those different things. So how did her husband, is there anything that you found that showed
Well,
her husband like,
that's
wow?
that's an excellent point, Danya. And yes, excuse me. The book Masquerade does go into that. And she married Benjamin Gannett in Sharon, Massachusetts, in 1784. She died in 1827, and he died in January of 1837, so he outlived her. From the records that do exist, it does not appear to have been a particularly close marriage. They had 3 children in the early years of their marriage. They had a son, Earl Bradford Gannett, a daughter, Mary, and a daughter, Patience. And then in 1796, she adopted a baby whose mother had died, Susanna Shepherd. And so she adopted a child of her own. And they say that in her diary of 1802 and 1803, while she was on the speaking circuit, that there are references in there where she speaks of missing her children, but she never speaks anything about her husband. And from what few lines kind of exist, he seems to kind of chafe to some degree. He was always kind of living in the shadow of Deborah Sampson. She eventually she was put on the pension rolls of Massachusetts for the state of Massachusetts in 1805 by kind of special act. She eventually made it to the pension rolls of the federal pension rolls under the Act of 1818 and received the pension up to her death. It took a special act of Congress after her death around 1837 or so, 36, 37, to enact awarding a pension to her husband for her services. And they in this particular special act, they are very clear. Benjamin Gannett made no claims to have ever served in the military during the Revolution himself. And as Danya mentioned much earlier, yes, he died before any first payments could be made to him. So they once again congressional act to have the money transferred to her children.
See, the thing that strikes me is it took an act of Congress, and I believe you said it also took a special kind of bit of legislation in Massachusetts.
Yes, it did.
For someone who everyone knew had actively served. They had her military record.
That's
And
right.
it just seems crazy to me that they would have to go through that many hoops and that many steps for her to get a pension and then for her husband to get a pension just because she was a woman.
That's right. And in fact, you know what's really interesting, Brian, is the first real documentation that I could find that dealt with her military service in some of the details was in January of 1792. She petitioned the Massachusetts state legislature. And what she was petitioning for was her back pay, because apparently at the time that she was discovered, she had some back pay that was due to her, but because she was found out to be a woman, she apparently was not paid the money that was due to her. So in January of 1792, she went to the state legislature and she petitioned. She said, I joined up as Robert Shurtleff in May of 1782. I served honorably. There were officers who did make depositions on her behalf, and she was honorably discharged on October 23rd of 1783. And in fact, at the time, John Hancock was the governor, and they did wind up paying her 34 pounds in back pay plus plus interest going back to October 23rd of 1783. That was the day in which she was honorably discharged. But you're right, she had to fight for these arrears.
Wow, that's crazy. So so there was one question by Henry
I saw
Coynes.
something.
He said, has anyone located her descendants since? And you're good to answer that question for sure.
Yes, there are, in fact, there are women who have joined the DAR under her children. In fact, there are descendants of her, all three children, in fact, Mary, Earl, and Patience. We have the last person to join was in the early 900,000s, so that's fairly recent.
That's fairly recent.
And so there are women who are members of the society who are direct descendants of Deborah Sampson Gannett. Yep.
Wow. So the other thing is, and Shelley, she pointed this out, that there were other women. She spoke of one by the name of Sally St. Clair from South Carolina, disguised herself as a man and joined the Continental Army. Sally was described as a Creole, a woman of color, and as a woman of African and French descent. She was not discovered as a female until after she was killed in battle during the siege of Savannah in 1782. You have some names of other women that have also done it. Would you like to share that, or possibly?
Sure. I'm not familiar with the woman that Shelley mentioned, but I don't discount that there are others who did something similar. She certainly is. Deborah Sampson is the one who's well known. There are two other notable women, though, that I thought I might mention today. There was a woman by the name of Margaret Cochran Corbin. She was married to her husband, John Corbin, and she was born in 1751. Her husband, John Corbin, joined an artillery unit that was affiliated with the state of Pennsylvania, and she went along basically as a camp follower initially. And at the defense of Fort Washington on Manhattan Island, I believe it was 1776 or 77. During the battle, during an engagement, her husband was killed in action, and she picked up and filled in, where he left off. And for her, and she was wounded in the shoulder and in the arm. And in fact, the Continental Congress awarded her some money in July of 1779. And she, in fact, does show up on the rolls of what is known as the Invalid Regiment in her own name during the war. So she is one particular notable case. And it was kind of interesting. There's an interesting side note in more recent years. She died in 1800 and was buried near West Point. And for many years, people claimed that they knew where she was. Some place called Highland Falls is where she was initially supposed to have been buried. And then in about 1925 or so, the DAR had her reinterred at West Point, and they put up a Margaret Cochran Corbin monument at West Point. And they were doing some sort of work, construction work around the monument around 2015, 2016, when they disturbed a grave. So they thought, well, now we've disturbed this grave, we better look into it. So they first made sure that it wasn't a homicide, and they realized, no, it's not a homicide. And they thought, well, okay, this must be the grave of Margaret Cochran Corbin. So they called in the archaeology teams. They did a forensic study. there was enough DNA evidence that they were able to get some DNA samples, and lo and behold, they discovered from the bones, from the study of the bones as well as the DNA, that it was a man between about 5'7" and 6'6", and they knew it was a man because they had Y DNA that was recovered from the bones. So
Wow.
So the person who was believed to have been buried at Margaret and Corbin's grave in West Point was not Margaret Corbin.
Oh no.
But it's an interesting sidelight. And in fact, I did find a neat PDF online. If you go to online and look at the burial of Margaret Corbin, there is a PDF you can look up and tells you about the excavations. The other lady who did something similar to Margaret Cochran Corbin is a woman by the name of Mary Ludwig Hayes. Her husband fell at the Battle of Monmouth, and she filled in. Both of these women kind of fill in what we sometimes refer to as Molly Pitchers, and that's kind of a general term. But both of them, and Mary Ludwig Hayes received a state pension from the state of Pennsylvania. So they were both recognized during their lifetimes as well for the services that they performed in their own right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Indeed, and I'm just still really curious how different women seem to receive different fates. Because as I said, some women were discovered in service, because Deborah actually mentions them herself in her writings, who were disgraced, they were dishonorably discharged, some of them were arrested. So it's just interesting how some women seem to fare pretty well, and then others were just absolutely penalized. There's just no consistency there.
That's true.
It was who you know. It was who you knew.
And of course,
Deborah knew big people.
As with the story with Cathay Williams, when people talk about what was it like on a day-to-day basis for her to maintain this role, and that's the thing. She's a young woman. So this isn't just a kind of thing. She did this for a year and a half. She maintained played this role for a full year and a half, basically. So yeah, it is a very compelling story, and a story that deserves to be told.
Yeah.
Because again, I can imagine, her male comrades were like, wait a minute, why are you always going off in the woods by yourself to do your business when we're all kind of here with, in the latrine? Just those day-to-day logistical things, as you were saying, to conceal.
Exactly.
And that's I'm sure that's why, even if you have women who felt similar, and they might have thought, well, I don't know that I can pull this off, because that took some gumption, that took some real took some real will, and you had to have a real desire to try to pull this off.
Right. Well, I want to thank you. That hour has gone so fast, and I just want to thank you so much for talking about one of the. Yes, we're just talking about one of the greatest women. We do a lot. Women are awesome. I'm glad to be one. So.
and that's the thing. There is no doubt in my mind that there are a lot of things that females did during the American Revolution that either A, they will never get credit for, or B, we will never know their stories.
Right.
To a great extent, history is a history of what the males did. In many instances, it's the story of the accomplishments of males, and that's kind of just the way that history has been. Very patriarchal societies. So where you have the stories of women, they kind of stand out because they are so more unique.
Right.
And that's why we cover these stories during Women's History Month.
Yes, we do. So next week,
and actually beyond. But next week
we are talking with Ron Lax. Henrietta Lacks's grandson. When I tell you guys, I've been trying to get this guy for about a year and a half now. I'm so excited to learn about Miss Henrietta Lacks and her story. He's her grandson, and he's telling the story of his grandmother from his eyes and from his father's eyes, because his father was the oldest child. So again, don't forget to join us next week to talk with Henrietta Lacks's grandson about the book Henrietta Lacks, The Untold Story with Ron Lacks. So,
So,
Forrest, I want you to stay on.
Sure.
so until then, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We will see you next week right here, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Yes, bye, everyone.